Hi, thank you for coming. It's with a small amount of guilt that I'm going into this talk, which is that almost every time it seems like I need to get an artist monograph in the U section or like the erotica section, there's one of these going on, and I'm like foiled. So there's that. But beyond that little bit of guilt, I want to just say how honored I am to moderate a talk tonight between these two men whom, as writers and also as people, I both admire and adore more than, there's no one that I could think of that I admire and adore more. In lieu of an introduction for both of them, I just wanted to start by reading a little bit, just a page from each of their writing, to give you a sense of the voice and some other things that will come up in the talk. So I'm going to start with Peter. I'm going to start with something from Peter. Oh, also, this is a galley of Peter's book that's coming out in February, called Hot, Cold, Heavy, Light. It's a collection of 100 pieces of writing on art. So, here's this. A blurry surveillance tape showed two men schlepping a painting out of a second-floor window and down a ladder. One man fell off the ladder. I had mixed feelings watching it on network news. I would not have wept to see the guy break his neck. Some other time. But while the painting was at risk, I wanted him to be a pulled-together cat burglar, not a gravity-challenged bozo. I wished the jerk finesse. The place was the National Museum of Norway in Oslo. The painting was Edvard Munch's The Scream, which turned 100 years old last autumn. It is a terrifyingly delicate object, 3 feet high and about 2.5 wide. It is made of oil paint, pastel chalk, graphite, and milk-based Cassian on a piece of cardboard. It is infinitely precious to me and, I think, to everybody, whether they know it or not. Would the theft have become television news without the slapstick video? Days passed with no further word, and the networks remained mute when, at last, newspapers reported the rumors that the painting was being held hostage by anti-abortion fanatics. The ransom was to be propaganda, a broadcast on Norwegian television of the anti-abortion shockumentary The Silent Scream. It appeared that Munch's painting had fallen victim to the coincidence of its title. Fame made it a target too, of course, though the paucity of news coverage confused me on that score. Didn't anyone care? Then it occurred to me that, in most people's minds, the scream isn't an object but an image, the distended mask of existential terror. Images can't be humped out of windows. They are everywhere and nowhere. You can't steal something that exists in thousands of reproductions, cartoons, greeting cards, and, lately, inflatable toys. Many people find the image irresistibly funny, over the top. The derision may be self-protective. A joke is the epitaph of a feeling, Nietzsche said. The feeling buried beneath amusement and at the scream is universally stalking aloneness and dread. Who wouldn't prefer a callous chuckle to that? But you can't patronize when in front of the physical work. Then it's a fact. So that's the opening to an essay called A Theft in Norway. And then this piece is by Paul. It is hard to say when we first met, because I cannot remember knowing him or feeling his presence. It's sort of like asking, when do you first remember meeting your older sister? But if you want a starting point, maybe it was 1960 at Cherokee Lane Elementary School. I have vivid memories of hanging out with Irony during recess in the first grade. At first, I guess, I thought he was just another imaginary friend. But there was something about the way he critiqued the other kids' performances in dodgeball, or the funny looks he gave me when we ducked and covered during civil defense drills. I remember him during Thanksgiving advising me on what colors the feathers should be on the turkeys and the Indians, but I could tell he wasn't really into the academic side of things. He was cool, like the hoods with their green work pants and black Chuck Taylor tennis shoes, smoking Marlboros at the bus stop. But unlike them, he never looked like he was trying to be cool. He just was. As my childhood unfolded, I relied on him more and more. A few times a week, he'd fall by the crib, and we'd watch Bullwinkle together. Irony explained things I didn't get, like who Norman Mailer was and why Russians are funny. He told me scandalous stories about Hannah and Barbera, agreed that I would make an excellent pilot with a pretty good chance of becoming an astronaut, and listened to my theories on turtles and slot cars and ice cream. He was there for me when I earned my Indian dancing merit badge and when I and other privileged scouts lined Pennsylvania Avenue one January for President Nixon's inaugural parade. I stood there in my uniform, beyond frozen, and he kept me in stitches with his color commentary on the floats. When the presidential limousine rolled by, Irony, wearing black leather from head to toe and a red bandana that said, "Kill for Peace," offered a power salute, and I remember thinking, wow, I'm really glad he's invisible. So that just is to give you a little sense of the kind of imaginativeness, the playfulness, the voice, and just the intelligence of these two men's work, that the more I've read it, the more wonderful it has become. And so I guess as a way of starting, I wanted to ask each of you if you could speak to some aspect of the other's work that you are interested in or intrigued by or that you find important. Maybe start with Peter.
I'll start. Yeah, I got the book, highly recommended, and I met Paul through Jarrett, who I hadn't known of him until Jarrett talked of having interviewed this brilliant man, and I've since read everything I can get my hands on, and I've been pleased to get to know him. I think I think of him, remember public intellectuals? I mean, they're kind of a prehistoric species in American culture, but he's one. With humor, with lightness, with a sort of ambassador touch, he gets an amazing amount of things done in his writing, and in his shows. I mean, the Americans show that at the Museum of the American Indian, which I wrote about, and which I think Paul regards my review as in rather lukewarm terms, but that's part of why I respect. And if he were older and I were younger, he'd probably intimidate the hell out of me, but it happens to be the reverse. But on the ambassador time, he had run fairly remarkable. You can't really isolate passages from him because he will make a turn on it at some point. But certainly some striking. By the way, I think it's the best essay I've ever read on Western movies, from the standpoint of Native Americans. But pointing out that in fact you can, as has been done, like in Dances with Wolves, you can make all the white men evil and all the Indians virtuous, and you still got the same thing. I mean, it's still about the American frontier, and it's essentially patriotic. I would never have thought that. But here's something that's bound to get attention. And again, this is couched in such a way. But it said, okay, here's a general theory of his. Generally speaking, white people who are interested in Indians are not very bright. Generally speaking, white people who take an active interest in Indians, who travel to visit Indians and study Indians, who seek to help Indians, are even more not very bright. I theorize that in the case of white North Americans, the less interest they have in Indians, the more likely it is that one, and here I mean one or another me or another Indian person could have an intelligent conversation with them. But actually, since reading him, I have been compulsively reading about Native Americans, and so I guess I'm not very bright. And Jarrett has been on Indian reservations and has undergone ceremonies in Sweat Lodge, so I guess he's lost his marbles entirely. But
just outed me as dumb.
I don't know. But it's interesting. It's like he keeps you awake. Like Beethoven, it's like you think you're getting it, and then you think, no, I didn't get it. This is it. No, that's not it either. It has to do, I think, with intellectual honesty. There's a music in honesty. It's like you never, the resistance is never awakened. So it's like you're almost just drifting through it, but meanwhile the ideas are seeping into you, and to the point where it almost feels like you thought them yourself. Anyway, I am incredibly honored to be in his company tonight. Paul,
that seems like a lot of pressure, but I don't know. When you were first engaging with reading Peter's writing, or what did it mean to you, or what were you interested in by it?
So I sort of drifted into writing about art very gradually, and it basically was about, I was part of the American Indian movement for a while. That kind of blew up, and depressed about that. It seemed like a smart idea to move to New York. I was living in California back then, and so I lived here from 79 to 91. And basically the political scene became boring, and I found myself hanging out with artists more and more, and Native artists and others. And it was sort of this, I was very clear I didn't have any deep understanding of art. But because I was hanging out with artists, going to shows, I started being asked to write about things sort of related to art. And so at that time, I read The Voice, I read The New Yorker. I usually read the music critics first. But when I read Peter, what I appreciated first was, the way he organizes sentences and the beats and the attention to it not being just pretty but impactful, and this great respect for the audience I feel like he has. So much of the art world in the last 20 years, 30 years has been so much theory-based, and I'm not an anti-theory guy. I like theory, but the accessibility almost sounds like a bad word or something, but I learned a great deal from his writing. He was a person I read more than other critics. So I think it was a lot being sort of seduced by the mastery of language, and then of course there's so much he's putting into this incredibly tight frame of fairly short pieces since he's been at the New Yorker. And I admire the economy of that and the precision of it. So, he's somebody I've learned a great deal about art from by reading him.
I like the way you described an aspect of Peter's work, which is respect for the audience. And one thing, and Peter started by saying that there used to be this thing that existed before I was born called public intellectuals, and you happen to be one of them. I guess it's like, someone who's like a saint, but who's born in the 19th century. It's like, this doesn't make sense. But I wanted to ask about the role of a public or an audience for the writing, and how you conceive of that in the writing, and what role that it plays, and maybe even how it functions differently at different times.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, it had to do with my biography of being in the 60s, being a Midwestern college dropout and working my way east as from Minnesota as a newspaper reporter, and at a time when it used to be that every town had a daily paper in this country, and so you could get jobs for almost no money. But I ended up by sheer happenstance in Jersey City in 1962 and found my way across into the poetry world on the Lower East Side, which would then coextensive with the art world. Anyway, one thing led to another. But I think and I was always a poet. I sort of ceased to be a poet about 20, 30 years ago. I didn't know what a poem was anymore, and I wasn't hanging out with poets because the art world parties were so much better. And so I decided to leave it to those who were committed and plow whatever I had into the prose. But anyway, I think I had a way with words. I was a word-drunk kid, and and I could sound pretty good about things I knew nothing about. But then working in city rooms of newspapers, I was subject to extreme discipline. I think my mentors were these fat, burned-out reporters, alcoholics with cigars around the city desk with the number one pencils. They were like crayons, and marking up your copy and not looking at you and throwing it back. And you had to figure out, and until you wrote clear, direct, informative sentences in the proper order, then it would just go down to the linotype, and it felt like it won something. I don't know, so I think anyway, it was sheer, and then I got into writing art criticism by sheer happenstance of the fact that all the poets then wrote for Art News, and you wrote one-sentence reviews for, I think, $3 or $4 a pop, and you did enough of them if you lived on Avenue B and, had an apartment for $40. Anyway, I don't know, this is a very long-winded answer, but it's the journalism is, the public is the first term of it. I mean, it's all directed to a public. And, there may be political slants and biases, but in terms of art, to me, it's just whoever's interested, and it doesn't, there is no entrance requirement in terms of educational credentials or politics or sex or race or whatever. And it's anyways, so I do it. It is a vague idea for me. I mean, in a way, it's sort of like dropping something down a well and waiting for the splash and not hearing one. I think, well, maybe I don't do social media, so, I may, for all I know, be getting tons of feedback that I never see. And, as it is, I'll get, a letter from someone who generally seems half crazy every 2 or 3 months. But, I mean, as long as my editors say it's okay, then. But I mean, first of all, nobody became an art critic except by accident before the 60s, by the end of the 60s, the first college course in art criticism. I just discovered that it was the thing I did best that they paid for, and that seemed like a really good deal. So public, Paul.
I always had this idea that I was a writer from when I was maybe in high school, and I wrote for an underground newspaper that lasted 2 issues. But well into my 20s, I never actually wrote anything, but I felt I was somehow a writer. And at one point, I guess I decided I should actually, start writing something. And I always had a couple of ideas. One is writing for money. There are some writers that just write. They write diaries, they write notebooks, they write the first novel, maybe it'll be published. But I didn't have the discipline to just write to get better. So I had to have an idea of who I was writing for. I wanted to get paid, even if it was $40 from some Canadian art gallery. When the exchange rate was really terrible, it's really $20. And then you take it to the bank and they charge you $30. It was awful. But the other thing was wanting to figure things out. So that's sort of become, it's sort of a high bar for me to write about something. That's one thing I admire about Peter. He's able to find so many things to write about that he's interested in. And for me, I need to, it has to have a particular project, a moment, and it has to be about things I'm uncertain about, that I'm figuring it out. If I know what I think, it's not as interesting to actually write about it. And it's the idea of audience, not just getting paid, but the idea of it actually communicating. And that's a great privilege of being a writer with an audience, even if it's not large, because you find out other people are thinking the same way, or they question it, or they're at least interested in what you're thinking about. And that's pretty magical to be able to find that happens, that you put things out there.
Barnett Newman said an artist should write now and then in order to have something to read. No, but I think if I know what I think before I write, and so I've written, it's not a subject for me. It's dead. I write. I find out in the middle, and then maybe the reader finds out along with me, and that's enjoyable. By the way, in terms, I don't know, would I write anything except on a deadline? Back when I was a poet, I would wait weeks and months between inspirations. Deadlines are much more efficient. It's like terror, rather than desire. And I like to say, since I started out as ignorant, that everything I know I learned on a deadline. But 50-some years of deadlines, I know quite a bit. But it's all patched together. It's like quilted. And in terms of money, yeah, no, it's. I have several professional kind of rules of thumb. One is advice to anyone really, is two principles. One, never do anything for money. Number two, be very well paid for whatever you do. Okay? So it's like, you are the angelic inspired being, and the hard-nosed, collector, the thug who comes in and collects. It works out well. And, and having a mortgage is, I think it beats the divine afflatus, all hell.
One thing that strikes me is that you both had, Peter starting as a poet and writing in that very small milieu which exists for poetry, you sort of know who you're talking to. And Paul, many of the essays that were published in Everything You Know About Indians Is Wrong, which I would also say is a really great book, and you should 100% have it, or else, were originally written as essays for catalogs in smaller places that one may or may not have encountered, but I am sure when you wrote it, you had a pretty good sense of who would be reading it. And now Paul is a curator at the Smithsonian, and Peter writes for the New Yorker. And I think that that's a very different relationship to scale, but also to what your role is as the people you're communicating with. And I would just like to know more about that transition.
The role is assigned. It's like I worked for the New Yorker. I wrote for the Village Voice. It was different. But I don't know. I don't know. The editor, the magazine knows. who it's for, because it's got to survive. You know, it's like I don't. Back in The Voice, actually, it was much more freewheeling, and I would collaborate with the photographer. I'd write the headline. At the New Yorker, I don't. You know, I think my principle is I bake the cookies, they make the box, and it works out very well. But you know, by the way, you don't. Being in a poetry world, you don't write for people. You write to depress people if you're any good, and to cheer them up no end if you're lousy. So, no, I mean the St. Mark's Dead Silence is a St. Mark's Poetry Project standing ovation. Okay.
Do you have a response to that, Paul?
I don't know. I guess at the Smithsonian, when I'm writing exhibition texts, you know, I'm really aware of an incredibly broad cross-section of people. So, and success is making that work for, you know, the broadest possible kind of audience without sacrificing what you're trying to say with it having impact. So you give up certain things, you know, certain, you know, insider references I could make about native art when I'm writing for a native art show in Lethbridge, you know, in 2002 or something. But it's compensated by the idea of the smartest possible work for the largest kind of audience. I'm taking that into account, but I feel like I'm still writing the same way. And I would imagine that's true for you. The Voice gave you more room, but fundamentally it's not a different process.
No, but it's well, Jarrett, the book that he showed you that's coming out, he gave the title to it, Hot, Cold, Heavy, Light, which is, I'd been dithering about this book for 10 years, and he stepped in and edited it for me, and to which I'm eternally grateful. And also, but also divided it into sections with these different rubrics, and I didn't understand it at first at all. But then I see that, yeah, no, there are tonal differences, you know, and but I'm never aware of that. I'm only aware of what's right in front of me, and I don't know. I don't know what. Are there any writers who are good editors of their own work? I think that's really a specialty that should be farmed out.
Well, it seems to me like one strategy that you both have developed, but very differently, and that could be filed under the spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down filing cabinet, is that you engage with the first person and with the character of your own experience in very different ways. I think the PCS character in the writing is extremely strong and funny, and one would get the sense of that even in that thing that I read about a place called Irony. And I think that that's one tool that you use in order to bring people along with you to some place that might be challenging, whether it's politically or intellectually, or even just really specific material you want to get into. And so I'd love to know more about that.
Yeah, I do think there's something the two of us share in common, which is making each sentence justify itself. Which you don't always have to do in other modes of writing. You have a lot of room, you can digress, and wanting each sentence to count, and you know, not wanting to bore people, you know, and I can get bored with myself very easily, and the topic and everything else. So I think it's like, you know, you can't say you're trying to entertain, I guess, if you're a serious writer.
It is a performance. You are performing, you know, and it better be fun. I mean, first of all, as we're talking about art, you know, it better be fun. or
Artists are
there's been some categorical error here. You know, it's like, you know, I mean, cancer is serious, war is serious. You know, politics are serious. Art is fun. You know, but like any game, it has to be played with absolute seriousness or left alone. You know, you gotta. You ever be playing a game and somebody tried to change the rules in the middle? You know, and I guess in a way, it's like I'm on a lifelong quest to figure out what the rules of the game are, and I'm, you know, still working on it.
You've never been to the College Art Association, I don't.
No. They gave me the prize and dismissed me for the rest of my life.
One thing that I've noticed about what's going on in both of your recent work is that I'm sure many of you have been following the recent sequence of reviews that Peter has done in the New Yorker, but something that I guess strikes me because I'm in a position to like talk to you, but also I've been thinking critically about your writing in terms of working on this book, is it feels like this sequence that include Bill Traylor, Hilma af Klint, Bertha Morisot, are really a kind of concerted push to rework and reframe what constitutes like a canon or an inside versus an outside. And I think the show that Paul has up right now at the Smithsonian and will be there for until 2015. It'll be there for a number of years. It'll be there for 5 years, called Americans, aims at a similar kind of maneuver in which it's almost like the way that you turn a kaleidoscope and all the little bits get turned into a different picture. And I think that's where I was trying to go with this question of audience, but maybe that's another way of trying to get at it. I don't know how you see it like that.
Well, actually, David Remnick at the New Yorker likes, you know, to exert a certain liberal pressure, which is good for me, and has been a revelation. I think in terms of inside and outside, in the last actually couple of columns, I've come around to an idea that there is no inside or outside anymore. I mean that it's time to let all the cannons fall, and there's this great horizontal spread of phenomena, and you know, I mean, there's a period we've gone through of sort of, you know, identity politics, you know, as a necessary thing of forcing certain constituencies and categories and through the door into the, you know, the fortress of the museum. But I think that you know, Joshua's blown the horn. The walls are down, and it's possible to simply just walk up to something and write about it. And I mean, I'm very happy with the opportunity to write about Bertha Morisot at this point in my life. I don't think I could have done it before. It's like, actually, there's a show at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. It's fantastic. And here's an artist who I think Jared gave me the line. You know, she isn't underrated. She's not rated. You know, she was absolutely one of the gang with the Impressionists, but you know, she just didn't register. And you know, as if she didn't have a style. Yeah, she had a style, and it was all hers, and it's fantastic, and she's a great artist. But it is like, you know, but it's not like having to do justice to her as a woman, although, you know, I said, you know, that the title of the show is Bertha Morisot, Woman Impressionist, which is kind of, it sounds like special pleading, you know, but I think it's really ironic. It's just sort of flipping it, you know, and that'll fade away. It's, I don't know, and just how Paul has put, you know, Native American stuff, you know, into circulation, and it's. I mean, you got to see this show, the American show. I mean, it's like, it's a lot of fun, you know, but it's also it also gets in and rearranges your molecules. You're not gonna think the same anymore.
I'm sort of in some recent pieces. I'm really communicating a lot of ambivalence about the lack of or the destruction of master narratives. You know, that there aren't the same kinds of, you know, consensual cultural agreement on things like Westerns, you know, that were a huge part of American culture. They still exist, they still have some meaning, but there's much less agreement on what any of those things are. It's a million-channel universe, it's million-channel ideas, and for what I write about, I sort of need those larger narratives to push back against. So it's a challenge when that isn't there. With that Americans exhibition, the twist we figured out was to say, okay, here's all these representations of Indians that aren't real Indians. Some of them are racist, most of them are more noble, heroic Indians, and an audience in 2018 that comes to our museum is trained to think this is all bad, this is all wrong. So the twist was to say, well, maybe all of it isn't bad. Maybe it's actually a much bigger thing that's going on, rather than letting people immediately get to what the answer is. The answer being, this is all terrible.
Yeah, but in a way, you're working against your own, which, by the way, I left out that I have a deep yen for the agreed story, the master narrative. You know, I was brought up and, you know, or happened into in the 60s, you know, the idea of modernism, the idea of progress in art, the canon. I miss it a lot on some level, but, you know, I can't kid myself. You know, it's like, it seems to me the only way we're going to get that back is let everything go flat, you know, and then wait for people, younger people, to come along and say, "Yeah, that's okay. I really like this," you know, and have it reform. You know, we're going through a transition, and you know, and you know, we may be going to hell, but you know, I need to get up at bed in the morning, so I think, you know, I'm going to make a bet that's not so. and if, you know, and if we do go to hell, you can sue me, you know, say, you know, you fucked me over. No, no, I mean, I think making anything, writing anything is an optimistic act, you know, that it's going to be, that the world is going to exist long enough for somebody to look at it or read it, you know. There's no guarantee of that. I don't know. But also, Paul has written brilliantly about the atom bomb. There's a great passage in here. Just from, you know, having grown up with the atom bomb, you know, the sense that, in fact, you know, next week was not guaranteed, you know, for, and, you know, and I think it was still adjusting to that, to this. Well, it's still there, you know, it just doesn't, nobody's put missiles in Cuba lately, or that we know of. Where am I going? Go, Paul.
So you're saying it's like going to be a community project to see which narratives stand the test of time.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, actually there's a show coming, I'm going to write about, there's a show, sort of, I'm going to be very interesting to read what I say. It's about, to Matt Breuer of abstract painting after the war, where abstract expressionism is shown on a level with South American abstraction, European influence at the time. And I mean, it's just a kind of a pluralist thing, and like seeing if they can put Pollock and de Kooning and Barnett Newman and Rothko like in a level, you know, and it's like part of me wants to scream and throw things, you know, because they were my gods, you know, I grew up with them as gods, and I'm going to have to test. I mean, you know, the show is very timely, you know, it's like, you know, am I crazy? I mean, aren't they better?
Well, I guess that's the special aspect of the work of art, is that it sticks around, and hopefully it can stick around long enough that people can say, oh, I really love this. This thing is really great, and I guess that's essentially, I guess, what a canon is a congealed or fossilization of a bunch of things that people thought were the best, that they loved more than other things. And the people who were in charge of having those opinions were a very narrow selection of people. But I do think that that's the most optimistic way to think about it, is that like some of those things will really stand up for themselves because that's what they do aesthetically or whatever.
You also hope that they have some meaning beyond themselves. I mean, I guess I regard art since the 19th century as being functioning off and on as a substitute religion, and it certainly the century of ideology. That modernism was another ism, was communism and fascism, and it's it gave structure to arguments, and now there's, I don't know, I feel a little bit lost.
But Paul, this functions so differently. The thing that Peter and I are sort of sketching out has always functioned very differently when you look at Native American art and culture and the narratives that surround it and the ability to look at it. And so how do you engage with that, or what do you see from having that long experience gives you a vantage of what's going on now culturally in a larger sense?
So I guess I come back to the moment, which is somehow never changes, which is Indians are 1% of the country, 330 million Americans, a million or two Native Americans, and most people in the U.S. never see Indians on a regular basis. So Indians are imaginary. So Indian art comes out of tourist art, of salvage anthropology and stuff you buy when you go to the Southwest. So this struggle to have it be judged like other art of the time has always been a great challenge, and it's been difficult because we're having to sort of, in a way, argue there's something special about Native contemporary art when, as my colleague here in NMAI, we have a museum here in New York, says Indian art is art made by Native people. That's all you can really say. There's not a thematic, practical way that any of it's linked. So it's kind of unsatisfying to try to make that argument. And it feels like, please look at our art because we're Native Americans.
No, but you named your show Americans. The ism I left out is patriotism, which I think we share. There's a nice line in the New Yorker in the Times the other day that some quote from somebody that patriotism is love of your people, and nationalism is hatred of somebody else. I think that patriotism has a bad rap. I mean, it's America is this ongoing project. It's this self-inventing, weird, completely unprecedented phenomenon. And basically all the arguments are about what it is and what it should be, and but they'll never cease. They never stop, and that's why. About abstract expressionism is a kind of national myth symbol. I mean, it's like American art won the World Series in 1950. Okay, of course the rest of the world was bombed flat, so it wasn't much of a competition. But I was always thrilled by that. remember, like the first time I saw some of the 40s works by William de Kooning, I burst into tears. It's like, because I'm a Midwestern, I'm a prairie guy, it's like, it was like nobody made a better painting in 1946 than that. It's like, it was one of us, by gosh. And that's, I guess I'm suitably embarrassed by that, but it doesn't seem to me to be malign. I said, the United States of Walt Whitman, and I think the brilliance of the American show is showing that American history and consciousness and society has been saturated with Indianness, with Native Americanness. It's like, think about it or not, and it's like, it's really like, this show isn't about telling you something new, although it does. It's bringing to consciousness stuff that's there already. I mean, it's like exciting. It's like, who was Moliere's gentleman, who was thrilled to discover that all his life he'd been speaking in prose. It's like all our lives we've been, part Indian, whether we're Elizabeth Warren, oh God, or not.
Do you want to respond, Peter or Paul, or do you feel led to speak?
America, Paul.
Yeah, on America.
My position on America? An ongoing project.
I feel like I'm very torn, because I want to ask you both one last question and then open it up to questions from the audience. And the last question is, I think of you, one of the things that I admire about an aspect of each of your work is your ability to make an argument that it's very unpopular, and to sort of try, not only to believe that one should do that, but then also do that in a way that is very subtle and has implications. And I think the things that immediately come to mind is, I was so stunned and delighted by a talk that Paul gave, and he gave a couple of times, around the Jimmie Durham show and its attending controversies. And I read a transcript of this talk. The first one, I think, was at the Walker, and I thought, oh my God, like a grown-up, like a really subtle person who's funny, and has a position from which they're speaking. And I think that Peter has also done that a number of times. I like citing something that I included in this book, which was his stance against Richard Serra's Tilted Arc, which, if you are in art school now, you're taught, like, the removal of Tilted Arc was the worst thing that ever happened for art, and the Philistines won. And Peter said, he wrote this series of articles that said, no, like, the people who live here don't like it, and that should be like the bar. That's the lowest bar that public art has to cross, is that the people who interact with it have to kind of like it, and beyond liking it, like, they feel oppressed by it. And so maybe this isn't a good piece of public art. So I would love to just hear from both of you about taking positions or being compelled to take positions that might be unpopular, and how you've navigated that.
Well, the Tilted Arc thing was awesome. I think that was braver than anything I did. And, really, at that moment of how heretical that position was, a remarkable opinion to put forward. I don't know. I think if you have a public platform and, the art world isn't really very important, and Indian art is much less important, but still it's a platform, and I think there's an obligation to use it. And I think if you really want something genuine to be happening between your words and people reading it, you have to be authentic. And at the same time, I did not want to weigh in on the Jimmie Durham controversy at all. He's someone I've known most of my life, a mentor in many ways. But the controversy was so polarizing, it wasn't something I wanted to engage in. I felt like I'm supposed to be a badass cultural critic, and I would have to hang it up if I wasn't willing to take that on. So I didn't relish doing it. And it cost me in certain ways. But it wasn't really a close call. It was more about when and how to do it. So I'm glad you liked it. A lot of people didn't.
Oh God, it's fantastic. No, sometimes it just drops in your lap. It's like you're the sheriff, and it's like no, you take on the rustler in the bar. No, well, the Tilted Dark thing. I mean, it was. I got screamed at parties. People literally screamed at me. Richard Serra, called me a fascist and said that he smelled the books burning. His wife called me up at 3 a.m. and threatened to sue me on some grounds. And people I really admired said, "Jesus, Peter," or I remember one of them, I quoted, said, who I still admire, but although he's dead, but he said, it'll be good for those workers, they'll quit and get new jobs, it'll change their lives, and I'm thinking, damn, it's like you work, you show up every day, you're a federal worker, you get enough crap from the government is going to say, wait a minute, I got it, now I'm going to put this, a steel wall in front of the door of the building. And one of the few open spaces on Manhattan Island, okay, and this is, the words public art, are a problem. They're a problem in a democracy. It's like being able to hit both words, with the same emphasis is almost impossible. By the way, I think Jeff Koons does it. I think every city in the country should have a Jeff Koons in the park. It really works. It's really public. It's really art. And it's silly and absolutely gorgeous. So
another dangerous position.
Yeah. Now I'm going to get defenestrated here. So
So does someone have a question they would like to ask to either Peter or Paul? And saying that makes me think of like I'll be the Mary. All right. If you raise your hand, they'll bring you a microphone.
For Paul, I don't know. I came into art history through sort of the back door of Native American because I have a background in Southwest archaeology, and I grew up with Indians, had a Native American roommate in college, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and worked for Joe Ben Wheat. So what I found when I sort of came into contemporary art with that background was that I had a completely different way of seeing art because I had been, I was steeped in the ghost dance. And I don't think that's a bad thing. And I wonder if you feel the same way, that instead of reading about the New York School, if you're reading about the ghost dance, that maybe that's also a valid entry point. And if you felt that you had a similar experience.
I actually don't know that much about those topics, archaeology or tribal histories or those things. So I didn't come at it from there. I think there can be, but I came to it, as an outsider, I guess, in terms of, not having formally studied things. So yeah, I think it can definitely be a useful thing to come at things from a different point of view, to not read all the same books, those kinds of things. Yeah. Does that get at what you're asking?
Well, kind of. When I taught it, When I taught at Barnard, I didn't like the idea of teaching Native American with all white people. So I had as many Native American speakers as I could get from the Smithsonian. And I felt that it gave the students such a much more interesting way of looking at the art. And they got so much more out of those speakers, you know, talking about, you know, medicine bundles actually being alive, things like that, or feeding masks, Hopi masks with cornmeal, and why that was important, was such a much more interesting way of looking at art than a lot of the sort of New York school texts.
Right, and they don't have to be in contradiction, right? They can be another way of understanding things that human beings make for different purposes at different times. Yeah, I think I think it's going in that direction. I think there's much more openness to bringing in that discussion than it's been in the past.
Anyone else? I think maybe we have room for time for one more.
Maybe one
Okay,
more.
you said two?
No,
You're the
one
man
is
with the clock.
one is
All right.
better.
All right,
Thank you.
so the last question. Oh. Oh, great. A lot of pressure.
Oh, I was waiting to come. I'm sorry.
Oh, ouch, ouch. All right, you can't think of something really fast?
No, well,
Would
Anyone else? The
like
last
to ask a
question, now it's all impacted. It doesn't have to be that good.
I've got one, or an audience member.
Yeah.
I was wondering if either of you could talk about, just because your opening introduction of Paul's writing had touched so much on irony as a constant companion in your youth. I don't know how real that was, but if you could talk about humor or irony or lightness, because I think of, Peter, your work having such, lightness is quite the right word, but like a dance that to me seems like humorous and lively.
Well, I think, humor is essential. It's essential to life. I mean, it's like, it's like, not being completely without humor is probably the clinical definition of depression. I mean, it's like where nothing is funny. It's also, there are different kinds of humor. I mean, wit, which is, I'm got myself as very much a follower of Oscar Wilde, which is, to me, wit is a sudden burst of speed. It's like you think there's an argument taking form, and suddenly you're at the end of it, and you don't know how you got there, and you laugh. It's pleasurable. And having to write in short formats, 1,400 word limit. I've reached a point where I can't really go beyond it. I mean, like 2,000 words, I get nosebleeds. I mean, I am a super specialist sonneteer, but no, it's like, if you don't have humor, you're going to have to work through to its metaphysical foundations every problem you encounter. You got to pull yourself out and get on with it. It's like, but leave the problem. I mean, don't dismiss the problem. But we're not going there today. Okay. What do you think?
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.